Hello, right, here we go then for our session on dating scams. Okay, I'm just going to open the PowerPoint. Here we go, dating scams then. Well, we say maybe matches made in cybercrime heaven. In other words, what dating scams are sort of attempts by scammers to obtain money from innocent victims who put their profiles on dating sites, and that's their sort of primary aim. Okay, so the signs then of being scammed. Firstly, in terms of the scammers, that is they tend to make immediate responses to people's messages. Responses might be received, every time you send a message, or at least within 15 minutes, which you wouldn't typically probably expect if you had a sort of genuine match on a dating site. But the scammers are kind of there, ready to receive messages and make responses rather more quickly, perhaps, than you might be used to. Research has noticed as well changes in the message content, and things like I've said the tone, the language, the style, and the grammar, which is kind of indicative of maybe several scammers working together. So the messages are kind of inconsistent a little bit in all these kind of aspects. That's why it does kind of evolve over time. Or it might be sort of one email which is worked upon by several different scammers at the same time. As you can imagine, people might respond differently. There might be individual differences in the ways in which they respond, and this is true of scammers as well. Third sign is probably that the profile picture they use is a little bit too good. What the scammers will have done was to maybe steal these pictures from websites or people's Facebook profiles, so they look rather more handsome or more beautiful than perhaps people might do typically. And fourthly, the crux of the scam is that the scammers will relay some kind of sob story, some kind of sad story, that is, which is going to get people to feel sorry for them. And the aim of the scammer, as I said, is to sort of extract money from people. So they relay this kind of sob story, which will get people to perhaps or at least try to get people to part with their money. And this might change, initially from a story which is a little bit annoying to the scammer, a bit of irritation, into some sort of emergency, which only you as the victim can help with. And scammers use two techniques in doing this. They use what we call the foot in the door technique. Foot in the door is where people might ask for a small favour first of all, and if people agree to help with a small favour, then they might help with a larger favour later on. So what the scammers might do, for example, is to say, oh, can you send me, let's say, £20, okay, which is a relatively small amount. And what we know from this foot in the door technique, that if people agree to this request for the £20 first of all, the scammers then go back with a request for a larger amount. Then people are more likely to agree to that larger amount, having firstly agreed with a smaller amount. They use a kind of degree of what we call cognitive dissonance as well, in as much as the scammers' aims are to sort of build up some kind of relationship then with the victim, and to get the victim to fall in love with them, which is rather surprising, I guess, because it's rather difficult, isn't it, to fall in love with somebody online. But if you love somebody, then you give them money. So what they're kind of saying is, can you send me some money? And if you say no, well, the scammer's going to come back and say, well, do you love me? And you say, well, yes. So if you love somebody, then your actions would be sort of consistent with your emotions. If you did actually feel that you love that person, then you do something for them. So they're employing that degree of sort of cognitive dissonance in terms of trying to get money from somebody. They use other kind of basic persuasive techniques. They're trying to get the victim to give them some unconditional positive regard, so that they're building a relationship with the victim then, in trying to sort of make the victim fall in love with them. So really what we want to know is that who is at risk from scams, because it's kind of important to know that who we need to protect from the scammers. Well, Monica Whitty and Tom Buchanan looked at this issue back in 2012, and they looked at things like things you might typically expect. People who are lonely might be more at risk, for example. People who are lonely might be a little bit more malleable. They're not talking to their friends and things so much, so therefore the only contact they have really is with the scammer. So you might expect that people who are lonely might be more vulnerable than people who are less lonely. You might think there are certain personality characteristics involved as well, in as much as people who are perhaps maybe a little shyer, more introverted perhaps, might be more scammable, shall we say, than people who are more extroverted. They also looked at romantic beliefs. People who had romantic beliefs, people who believed in love at first sight and love would last forever, fairy tale kind of love, that kind of thing. Those are the people perhaps who might be more at risk of being scammed. And fourthly, people who are sensation seekers, people who sort of throw caution to the wind perhaps when they're on dating sites. And those might be the people who might be more at risk of being scammed, as opposed to people who are a little more cautious perhaps. And surprisingly, what Whitty and Buchanan found was that of those characteristics, the only one really which was able to predict perhaps people who are sort of at risk at scams were those people who are high in romantic beliefs, those with a tendency, as we said, to idealization of a romantic partner, those who believed in love at first sight, love lasts forever, fairy tale love kind of things. Those are the people who perhaps were a little bit more at risk of being scammed than people who were lower in terms of their romantic beliefs. And here are some of the items here from scales which have attempted to measure romantic beliefs. If I love someone, I know I can make the relationship work despite any obstacles. The relationship I have with my true love will be nearly perfect. I expect that my relationship, romantic love, will really last. It won't fade with time. There will only be one real love for me. So those are kind of the things that if you score higher on those items, you might be higher in romantic beliefs. Okay, so staying with this issue then about who gets scammed. In a later study, Monica Whitty looked at a few more characteristics, which are these. You might think perhaps that people who are more impulsive might be more likely to be scammed than people who are less impulsive. People who are impulsive might just again throw caution to the wind. People with a kind of external locus of control. So whether the person believes that they have control of their environment or not. So if you know anything about locus of control, people with an external locus of control believe that things are controlled for them. People who have an internal locus of control believe that they have control over their environment and control of what they do. She looked at trust in others, so people who are trusting of other people. She looked at trustworthiness, whether the victims were trustworthy, kindness, and greed, and addictive personality traits. So as a kind of excuse me, have a drink of water. In contrast to the earlier study, then she looked at a few more different characteristics of people's sort of vulnerability to being scammed than she did before. And in this study, Whitty looked at sort of 11,780 participants through an online survey. Obviously, vast majority of those, 10,700, were not victims of scams. 728 were victims of one-off scams. 329 were repeat victims, which is rather surprising. And over 3 different age categories, 18 to 34, 35 to 54, 55 years and over. So you might think in the kind of last little group there, 55 years and over, that people might be a little bit more vulnerable to being scammed. You might think that at that age perhaps people had become single because of divorce or become widowed, and might have been more vulnerable to being scammed then than people in the younger age groups. Okay, and the findings from the study were, I guess, unsurprisingly, that impulsivity, people who are more impulsive, people who are more trusting in other people, and people who had more addictive personality traits, people who were sort of, wanted to get back on the dating site all the time, were sort of, obsessed with doing that. These were the characteristics which predicted people's vulnerability, ability to be scammed. Of the different age groups looked at, surprisingly, from what I said earlier, the over 65 age group, only 16% of that age group were vulnerable to being scammed. So the most sort of at-risk age group then was that age group between 35 and 54. Okay, and again, rather surprisingly, what we found was that more educated people were more vulnerable to being scammed than people who were less educated. So it's not to do with how educated, how qualified, how bright you are. It's more to do with these kind of things which make you more vulnerable. And perhaps more educated people might have had more money, be more likely to use dating sites, that kind of thing. So those were the people who were in that kind of vulnerable group. Rather surprisingly, we also talked of the second wave of scams. So this just rather shows the kind of audacity, if you like, of the scammers. That went. Oops, I can go back. There we go. Okay, so when the victim finds out, then that the scammer comes back on to the victim and pretends to be the police, and they would say something like, "Okay, yes, we've caught the scammer, but they're in prison, they're on bail." And the scammer says, "Well, you need to send some money to bail them out." The scammers might say something like, "Well, it was a bit of a scam at the start, and I was trying to get money from you at the start, but actually over the weeks I've been talking to you, when they've been grooming them, they've actually really fallen in love with the victim. And oh, by the way, can you send me some more money?" Or a third way, perhaps, in this kind of second wave of being scammed, is that the scammer might say, "Well, okay, I'm the scammer's bank manager, and this criminal has has died, or something like this, and can you send some money for funeral costs?" So they're really kind of pushing it to extract more money from the poor old victim for as long as possible. Okay, we looked at a couple of things about the victim profile. Oops, I'm going to go back. Okay. About their experience of online dating. Okay, about when they realised that they were being scammed, and what their reaction was to being scammed. So when we talk about people being scammed from online dating, this might be defined in terms of when they actually realise that they're being scammed. Because if they don't realise they're being scammed, I don't know if you might think, well, you might not define that as actually being scammed. And we also looked at their reaction as well to being scammed. Okay, so we used a couple of little tests as well. We looked at an attachment style questionnaire from Griffin and Bartholomew, where they categorised 4 different types of attachment. I've spoken about attachment style over the last couple of weeks. But we know that there are people who are securely attached, probably about 56% of us maybe. There are people who are what we call dismissive avoidant attachment styles. They display, people who display dismissive avoidant attachment styles are people who are kind of fairly autonomous, and they really don't care about not being with anyone else. Bottom left corner here, we've got anxious, preoccupied attachment. So people who are very kind of clingy, if you like, and people who sort of want to hold on to people. Probably about 15-20% of people in that age group, that attachment style group rather. And finally, we've got fearful avoidant attachment styles. People who really can't get close to other people. So we looked at all those different attachment styles, which we could determine from Griffin and Bartholomew's scale, to see if there was anything consistent in victim profiles in terms of those attachment styles. Okay, we also looked at the Big Five personality inventory, which categorises personality in terms of openness to experience. So you might, I guess, predict that people who are more open to experience might be more likely and more vulnerable to being scammed. There are people who are sort of conscientious. People who do things do things the right way. People who are sort of extroverted, people who are outgoing, people who are agreeable, people who want to sort of please other people, and people who might be more kind of neurotic. So that personality scale categorises people into those five or various measures of those 5 different personality traits. And we also used an emotional intelligence scale as well, which categorise people in terms of their well-being, the degree of self-control, how emotional they were, and how sociable they are. Okay, so our findings then. Firstly, well, we asked people, what made them realise that they were being scammed. So these are kind of some of the things which people come up with: that the scammer, cancelled the flight, that they asked for money. You might think, well, somebody's asking me for money a bit too soon, perhaps. That might not be. That might be a little bit of a telltale sign. That somebody might have confessed their love, immediately when they asked for bank account details. People might have checked their photos on Google. One of the main ones, actually, here is poor English. A lot of people said, that they realised it was a scam, perhaps because the person talking to them, even though they said they were British or English speaking, but their English in their messages wasn't very good. They kind of repeated things or didn't tell them about themselves, which might be kind of indicative that, as I said earlier, several scammers are operating together. Okay, and then there's the obvious ones underneath there, then that English is a second language, or they had very bad English. So those are kind of telltale signs, which I kind of hinted at earlier on. In terms of the amount of money people parted with, the kind of the mean amount was around about sort of 12,000. People confessed is rather, or revealed rather than that they parted with about £12,000, which is kind of rather disturbing. The amounts of money they parted with ranged from anything from £50 up to £63,000, which is rather a lot, I think. You might want to categorise scamming then in terms of who gave money. So going back to our personality scale, of the people at least that we surveyed who said that they gave money, we found significant differences in terms of conscientiousness. So people who displayed conscientious personality styles said that they paid money to the scammer more than people who were lower in conscientiousness, who did not pay. People who were neurotic paid more money to the scammer, or paid to the scammer, and people who displayed also a preoccupied attachment style. Okay, so those people who were kind of almost rather clingy, if you like, to their sort of so-called partner, so-called the scammer. Okay, they were more likely to pay money than people who were less preoccupied. We also considered the question about when is a person scammed. So, for example, in terms of are they scammed when they realise it and they tell their families, or did they realise it and tell the dating sites, or did they report it to the police? So really, those kind of things could be used as measures of whether people were scammed or not. Because as you can imagine, people might want to sort of keep that information to themselves. They might feel a little bit silly, perhaps, being scammed. Those kind of things, who they told, might be a kind of indication of their realisation of being scammed. Rather surprisingly, the reaction of the dating website, people said, that they'd heard nothing yet, that the dating site had ignored it, that they were still waiting to hear from them, that they emailed them, but there was no reply. or that they were unable to retrieve money, or they were rather amusingly sorry for the inconvenience. So it didn't really seem that the dating sites were particularly helpful in helping people who'd been scammed. Okay. In terms of people then who reported the scam to the police, in terms of emotionality from our emotional intelligence scale, it seemed that people who are more emotional were less likely to report the scam to the police. And that's the actually only finding we had there from those who reported the scam to the police. So in conclusion then, it seems like there are some predictors of sort of scamability. We've looked at some of those predictors of people who are likely to be scammed, and also some of the signs of the scammers and the psychological techniques used by the scammers. And that's it for today, so thank you very much for listening.